What I want people to understand is that when you're pulling a shot in the descent, you have this tablet on top of the machine, and it's incredibly intuitive. It's like using an iPhone. You don't need any instructions. Basically, like everything that happens after you've done it a couple times, you're like, oh, this makes total sense. And what we're looking at is we have this green curve, which is the pressure at the puck, and we have a blue curve, which is the flow rate of the liquid through the puck. Okay, and we have all sorts of recipes you can use. This is what we call like a pressure profile, and it's a lot like, it's inspired by the old lever machines, where the lever machine does a pre-infusion, and then when you release the lever, you shoot up to call it 8 or 9 bar, and then slowly that pressure declines, right? And this is a classic profile. I mean, this was essentially like one of the original espresso profiles in a sense, because lever machines used to be the norm. And it's beautiful because pre-infusion is really good for evenness of extraction and to get a high extraction. And it reaches a reasonable pressure. And then the slow decline helps decrease the amount of potential channeling, because as the puck erodes, it has less resistance to the water, and it's easier. If the water goes faster and faster through the puck, it's going to find channels, and it's going to basically drill holes in your puck, which is what happens in almost every espresso machine in the world. But I want to talk about graphs, but I also want to talk a little bit about how did you do this? Because even though I've known you for 3 or 4 years, this is still kind of a miracle to me that you're measuring temperature, flow, pressure. I think you once told me you're measuring pressure like 100 times a second, or some ridiculous number I couldn't comprehend. So can you give me like the stupid person's version of how are you measuring this stuff and how did you do it?
So in order to measure this stuff, you've got to plop down a whole lot of money and essentially custom make your espresso from scratch for sensors. And that's one of the reasons we haven't seen this. We've seen occasionally analog pressure gauges. For example, on lever machines, you can put a bike pump pressure gauge on there. But in order to measure this stuff, we had to rebuild the group head from scratch to put sensors in there. And one of the things we realized, I mean, it was cute because Ray, who wasn't a coffee guy, would ask very naive questions that were actually incredibly deep, such as, where do you want to measure temperature? I was like, oh, well, everyone just measures the boiler. It's like, yeah, but between the boiler and the coffee, what happens?
Right.
I know what happens. Why don't we put a sensor in both? He's like, okay, Ray loves complexity, so we put a sensor in both. And then a few other places too. So, but then you ask, okay, I want to measure the coffee temperature, right? So if you're making a V60 and you're pouring water in, you can put a temperature probe right in there because there's no pressure, and you can see what temperature your slurry is at. But espresso is under our 140 pounds of pressure per square inch. You know, it would just go everywhere if you tried that. So what we did is we built a group head and then bored a hole through everything to get a temperature sensor as close as we could to the coffee without actually affecting the coffee, because you don't want to actually screw up your shot as part of your measuring it. Mm-hmm. So you get a coffee puck, you put a little screen on top, which then holds the coffee puck down, and then we put our temperature sensor right behind it. So it's about 1 millimeter above the coffee, which gives us interaction effects between the coffee puck and the hot water, which had us learn a whole lot of things that you can ask about if you want to know. Pressure is actually a lot easier as long as you get yourself a digital pressure sensor. They're like $1.50. It's not a big deal. But it is complicated to build the machine such that that pressure sensor is right in there. Someone's made a Smart Espresso Profiler, and big shout out to them. Love them. And they, in fact, made a Bluetooth pressure sensor that fits into traditional machines. So it totally is a possible thing. Flow was by far the hardest thing. And flow is still a challenge for us to get really well. So flow meters work with a little windmill. It's called an impeller. And the problem is the range of espresso is both great in terms of the flow rate, and it also changes really quickly. Like you want to capture a channel, which might just go like that on the impeller. Traditional flow meters just don't do that. So if you power up any what's called volumetric machine, so a machine that stops on water volume, they will not tell you, oh, you want 80 milliliters of water in your shot. No, they will just count ticks internally, because those windmill motions are very unreliable. Sometimes you get doubles or no ticks at all. And that's why, until very recently, no espresso machine that I know of tells you the actual flow rate that's happening to your coffee,
Right.
Because flow meters don't work. So in the end, what I had to do, which was awful and cost a ton of money, is completely replicate the espresso machine in physics. So get out the calipers and measure everything so that our flow meter, which would work when the water flow was fast and then didn't work at all when it was slow, our physics engine would tell us what's actually happening.
Okay.